Back in 2009, myself, my wife, and our daughter, who had recently turned 4, moved into our first house up in Aurora, Illinois. It was a very happy and exciting period in our lives, and if you'd asked me at the time, the only difficulty on the horizon was deciding where to put my man cave, in the attic or in the garage. But when I look back on that time more than 2 decades later, I marvel at how blissfully ignorant I was. We'd moved out of a high-crime inner-city area that had gotten increasingly worse following the financial crisis. Our apartment had been burglarized once, and our car had been broken into twice in the year that preceded our move, and we strongly suspected one of our own neighbors to be guilty of the burglary. But proving it was another matter entirely, so when we moved out of the suburbs, I believed our trouble with the neighbors was over. But in reality, that couldn't have been further from the truth. It was exactly 1 week since we moved when I decided to take my daughter over to a nearby park which had this big jungle gym on it. We'd driven past it a few times already, and she was very focused on paying it a visit, so with it being a nice day and all, I figured that we could walk down there at a casual pace and I could introduce my daughter to the surrounding neighborhood. So, we're walking down to the jungle gym, and I've got the stroller loaded with snacks and all this stuff, but my kid is walking next to me, when we suddenly see a yard sale set up about 50 yards down the street. My daughter was a very sociable little girl back then, so as we walked past and I pointed out the 2 tables of various stuff to her, she immediately started just heading over to take a look. Behind the tables was a woman who looked to be in her late 40s or early 50s, who greeted my daughter with a smile before I told her that we were new to the neighborhood. We exchanged a little small talk, and I was taking a look at some of the stuff that she had for sale when I suddenly noticed this small doll nestled in among some grubby stuffed toys. Unlike its dusty-looking friends, the doll looked almost pristine, but what really caught my attention was how it looked so much like my daughter. It was almost uncanny. Now, I plucked the doll from among the other stuffed toys and then showed it to my daughter while saying, "Look, honey, this dolly looks just like you." And she fell in love with the thing right there and then. And after gazing at it sort of wide-eyed for a moment or two, my daughter walked over to her stroller and placed the doll in its seat. The woman behind the tables let out a very loud "ah" before I joked about how my daughter had left me with no choice but to buy it. And the lady thought for a second, then asked for just $2. I only had a 5 on me, so I gave the money to my daughter, and I instructed her to pay for the dolly, which she did in a way that prompted another "ah" from the lady behind the table, and then I told the lady that she could keep the change. She was very grateful, but honestly, I would have paid 5 times as much if she'd asked for it. Our daughter was very picky when it came to toys around that age, so to see her have this instant connection was just priceless. After that, my daughter didn't seem so excited about visiting the jungle gym anymore, and she insisted that we take her new doll back home immediately. And in case you were thinking, oh, this is some creepy Annabelle-type doll that's going to turn out to be haunted, well, let me assure you, that really couldn't be further from the truth. This thing was angelic, in a very good condition for something that looked so old-fashioned, so I was only too happy to let her have it, and I'm pretty sure that she wouldn't have taken it in the first place if it looked like a friggin' Chucky doll or something. Anyway, we take the doll back home. My daughter starts playing house with it and treating it like her own little baby, and my wife comes home to be as pleasantly surprised as I was. We'd spent literally hundreds of dollars on toys our daughter just never played with, and the only thing that seemed to keep her entertained was drawing on the walls or chasing the cat around the house. So to have her fall in love with something, really anything, that didn't cost us to replace or repair, it was a true godsend. The next day was a Sunday, so both me and my wife were home all day. I was upstairs putting together some furniture when the doorbell rang downstairs. My wife shouted that I'll get it up the stairs, then about a minute or 2 afterwards, I heard her calling me downstairs saying someone was there to see me. I remember walking out onto the first floor landing and looking down the stairs to see the lady that I bought the doll from just the day before. I walked downstairs to greet her, asked what we could do for her, and She responded by saying that she had a big favor to ask of us. Then, she took out $5 from her purse and asked me very politely to return the doll my daughter was just so enamored with. She explained that a mistake had been made, that she'd sold me something she shouldn't have and that she needed to get it back right away. It was a friendly request, but there was something behind it, too. I don't want to say that she was scared, but getting that doll back seemed awfully important to her, so much so that I said, sure, and went off to take the doll back for my daughter. The moment I stepped into the TV room, I saw her still playing with it, when she would have moved on from literally any other toy by that point, and I knew things were about to get pretty messy here. I walked up, kneeled down next to her, and explained that the nice lady needed to take her dolly back. I made up some excuse, that the doll belonged to another little girl and that she was really sad that her dolly had been mistakenly sold. If my daughter gave it up, it would make the fictional girl very happy, and I'd take her straight over to Toys R Us or wherever to buy as many new toys as she wanted. My daughter just simply looked up from her doll and started to bawl. Just absolutely crying. And cut to about 5 minutes later, my daughter has her limbs all wrapped around the doll and she's screaming like the little kid from The Exorcist. These ungodly, satanic screams were coming out of her, and they intensified every time we so much as lay a finger on her new favorite toy. It got to the point where, after my wife had taken over, I went back to the door to offer the nice lady $50 on top of what I'd already paid her, and when she refused the offer, I doubled it to $100. You could tell that she thought about it for a second, but then told me something to the effect of, "My husband is really mad at me for selling you that doll. I'd like to take the $100, but he told me I need to get it back, and I need to get it back today." Now, slight side note here, but hear me out. Number one, I really didn't want to give back the doll. I think she could have asked for $200 there and then, and I'd have driven her to an ATM or something. The amount of crap that we were going to have to go through if we tried to pry that doll out of our daughter's grasp would be beyond a mere mortal's comprehension. So at that stage, I think I would have done just about anything to avoid it. But then, there was that other thing, the way the lady seemed almost scared to go home empty-handed. If her husband was so upset that she'd sold the doll, why didn't he come over here to explain himself? I get that it was her that had sold the thing in the first place, and I'm all for people taking responsibility for their mistakes. But I don't know. Something about it just really didn't sit right with me. I didn't refuse to give the lady her doll back, and I didn't offer any more cash. But what I did do was tell her in the nicest way possible that if her husband wanted the doll back, he should come over so we could negotiate. I told her my kid loved that doll. Heck, she could hear all that racket herself, and unless it was an exorbitant amount of money, I was more than happy to fork over a lot more money to avoid my daughter hating my guts for probably a week or so. The lady seemed nervous, though, and said that she'd pass the message along, and then we said our goodbyes and I closed the door. Once we'd successfully calmed our daughter down, my wife and I got to talking about the predicament that we were faced with. I happened to mention my concern for the lady's home life. She then suggested that I do the neighborly thing and head over to the house where the yard sale had been to talk to the lady's husband myself. That way we could iron out the whole affair today while getting a read on the atmosphere inside their home. And so, off I went, walking down the street to the house where the yard sale had been, and when I got there, I knocked on the door and waited for a response. Only seconds later, the door swings open, but not before I heard a man's voice coming from the other side, and he didn't sound happy. The guy opens up the door, and I can see the yard sale lady standing in the hallway behind him. He's of a similar age to her, with a beer belly, thick beard, and a few wisps of hair on the top of his head. He takes a look at me and then looks back at his wife and says, "Is this the guy?" And she nodded, and then the guy turned back to me and asked, "All right, man, where is it?" I correctly assumed that he was talking about that doll, so I started to explain how I'd come over to talk to him about it. But I don't think I've gotten 2 sentences out before he cuts me off to say that he didn't care what I had to say. They wanted the doll back. They were offering a refund, and if I wanted a discussion, I could have one with the cops. And at that moment, I was stunned. Now, I had expected the guy to be pretty disagreeable, but not outright confrontational, and the idea of getting the cops involved seemed like such a needless escalation. I told the guy that there was no need to get any cops involved, and that all I wanted to do was resolve the situation with as little drama as possible, and he responded by saying if I didn't want any drama, I should have thought twice about talking so rudely to his wife. Again, I'm just about knocked off my feet by what he said, and I remember looking over his shoulder towards his wife, expecting her to do something, who now suddenly seems very focused to avoid making any eye contact with me. I thought about explaining to the guy that I'd actually been perfectly civil with his wife, but upon realizing that amounted to calling her a liar right there in front of her husband, and realizing that he was kind of a weirdo, I just said something to the effect of, "You know what? Call the cops. I'd be happy to speak to them." And then I turned around and walked back down the guy's driveway to the sound of him cursing me out like you wouldn't believe. And I remember my heart dropping in that moment. A few hours later, we get a call from the local police department, and I guess it shouldn't have surprised me so much, but I was genuinely shocked the guy had gone through with actually calling the cops. I was definitely interested to see what they had to say, and at first it didn't seem like the law was actually on our side. See, in the state of Illinois, merchants do indeed have the right to cancel a transaction or contract, but only if the recipient of goods or services has committed consumer fraud or employed deceptive business practices. Obviously, I had done neither, and even though the yard sale couple had definitely twisted the story to make it sound like I was the bad guy, I hadn't broken any laws, so I had zero obligation to return that doll. However, the officer did advise me that while I was obviously free to return the doll if I saw fit, that the best option was to simply stay away from the yard sale couple and avoid any further confrontation. I guess they'd been honest enough to admit selling me the doll on accident, which must have made it open and shut for whatever officer was unlucky enough to have received that call. I should also mention that prior to hanging up, I made it clear to the cop that I'd been willing to work with the yard sale folks at first. I tried getting it back from my daughter, I tried offering them more money, and it was all in an attempt to avoid any animosity between us and the yard sale people. We'd only just moved in, we didn't want to make any enemies, but they'd also put me in a position where I just didn't want to deal with them anymore. I knew the obvious solution was just to return the doll, but I guess wanting to keep my daughter happy, combined with a little bit of pride for myself and contempt for that yard sale couple, made for a less than stellar decision-making process looking back on it. And so, the day after that was a Monday, and I was off at work all morning, but not long after getting back from my lunch break, I got a call on my cell. It was my wife, and she sounded angry and upset. The yard sale lady's husband had been over to our house and, according to my wife, had subtly threatened her in reference to getting back the doll. Apparently, he'd made some half-assed attempt at taking it back, telling my wife that he was sorry for the way things had gone and that he'd like to start over, blah, blah, blah. But when my wife tells him that we'd been in touch with the police and that we'd made our decision, he dropped the nice guy act completely. My wife was even more mad about the situation than I was, so when the guy implied that he could just force his way inside and take the doll back, she gave him a verbal shellacking, told him that he'd have him arrested if he so much as stepped on our driveway again, and then slammed the door in his face. I was very proud of her that she held her own like that. But the idea the guy had paid my wife a visit when I wasn't there to do anything about it, it made my blood boil thinking about it, even all these years later. There were a few more incidents like that, nothing involving the guy coming to the house, but we got a couple of death stares and a rude comment or two while walking our daughter to the jungle gym. It wasn't anything that we couldn't handle, and we reminded ourselves that things could have been so much worse. We lived at least a football field or so down the street from them. If we'd have been closer, things would have been considerably more tense. Now anyways, a few weeks go by, and we were still getting looks that could kill whenever we passed the yard sale place in our car, but there had been no further escalations or anything of that nature. I should also add that even after a month or so of playing with that doll, my daughter still hadn't grown tired of it. She absolutely adored that thing. And spoilers, but she still has it, and it's without a doubt her most precious childhood possession. But as I was saying, things were going smoothly, and I thought things had blown over until one late Sunday evening when I heard a knock at our front door. I remember it was just a few minutes past 9, and being mildly annoyed that someone was visiting so late, it wasn't like I was running for the old Louisville Slugger like I would have been doing back in the city. So I get up, walk to the door, and I open it up to see old yard sale husband standing on our doorstep, and he looks absolutely sauced. I think I just sighed at first before asking him what he wanted in a voice that probably sounded more bored than anything else. I'd had a beer or two myself that evening, so I was definitely a little slow on the uptake, but as yard sale husband slurred out, "You know what I want," in response to my question, I noticed that he had his right hand hidden behind his back. And I didn't mince my words. I asked him straight up, "What do you got behind your back there?" And when he showed me, it was like space-time itself slowed to a painful crawl. It was a gun, and it was suddenly pointed right at my face. My hands were up before I even thought to put them there, and every action was just involuntary for a few seconds. I said, "Don't shoot," in the same involuntary way. It just sort of jumped out of my mouth like I wasn't in control of myself anymore. And at the same time, I felt all the color draining from my face, like my brain wanted to pass out but my body just wouldn't let me. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever experienced in my entire life, and I have no doubt it registered on my face too, because when the yard sale husband saw it, he started to smile. He said something like, "It didn't have to come to this, you know. You should have just given me back that doll when you had the chance." I backed up, stammering that I'd get it for him right then and that there was no need for anyone to get hurt. He took a step forward, walking through the open door to our home with that gun still pointed at me. He told me that he'd like to follow just to make sure that I didn't do anything, as he put it. I think he figured that I might damage the doll in some way or go get a gun myself, which would be an insane thing to do in that situation, but I'd also come to realize that whatever was going on was just about as far from sane as it's possible to get. I told him that if we're going to get the doll, we need to go upstairs into my daughter's room. Yard sale husband then gestures towards the stairs with the gun and says, "You first." I remember that. And it was only in that moment that I realized how incredibly screwed I felt. The moment I saw that gun, I should have just jumped back, slammed the door, but I completely froze up. And the weirdest thing, too, it's not even the first time I've had a gun pointed in my face, but the first time, I'd more or less seen it coming. But when I saw one in the hands of that yard sale husband that night with those bloodshot eyes and the slur of his words, that was a whole other level of fear. That first time, when I was mugged, I knew that if I kept my mouth shut and handed over my wallet that I'd be probably fine, and thank God I was. I was left to walk back to my apartment with nothing but a bruised ego, kicking myself for being dumb enough to walk around that neighborhood at that time of night. But yard sale guy, he hated me. This was way beyond just getting his doll back. Now I might return it, and he might thank me by shooting me right there in front of my own daughter or wife or both. But then, what other choice did I have? I'm not John Wick, and even if he was drunk as a skunk, I don't think I'd have been able to disarm him without someone getting shot in the process. And keeping in mind that my wife was asleep in the room almost right above us, so any of that Hollywood-style wrestle the gun up into the air then fire off all the bullets, nothing like that is ever an option. I walked up the stairs, my arms were still up, at as slow and steady a pace as possible. Once I reached the top, I explained that my daughter's room was towards the rear of the house, and that we'd have to walk down the hallway a little before turning into the room on the right. The sound of my voice then prompted my wife to appear from the bedroom, but before she had a chance to even ask who I was with, the sight of yard sale husband and the gun in his hand had her pulling back a scream. I told her to go back inside and close the bedroom door. She completely ignored me, stepped out into the hallway, and stood next to me in a way that blocked the passage of that yard sale guy. And then she looked him dead in the eye and said, in a voice that sounded terrified, but very defiant, "You're not going anywhere near our daughter, you sick son of a bitch." The yard sale husband looked deeply offended by the suggestion that he wanted anything except that doll. These days, I'm very proud of how brave my wife has been, but at the time, I was furious with her. Doing anything that would offend, antagonize, or even annoy the pistol-wielding drunk standing in front of us seemed just like complete insanity. But the crazy thing is, I think it actually worked for us. Like I said, he seemed almost offended that he wanted anything but his doll, and when he told us that, my wife suggested that she go get the doll, while we both wait in place. The yard sale husband seemed content with that outcome, but before she backed off towards our daughter's room, he informed her that if she did anything to that doll, out of spite I mean, that he wouldn't hesitate to put a bullet in me. I dreaded a repeat performance from my daughter in terms of throwing a tantrum, but somehow my wife managed to retrieve the thing without waking her up, and she handed it over to a very smug-looking yard sale guy before he ordered us back into our bedroom. He said that he could see himself out, and that he didn't want us showing him down the stairs or anything once he turned his back. We opted for our daughter's bedroom instead, even though there was no lock on the door or anything, and that's where we stayed, until we heard that guy slam our front door behind him. After that, I very cautiously made sure the man had actually vacated our home and obviously called 911 to report everything. The adrenaline dump was something, and mixed with the guilt and shame of having allowed an armed man on the second floor of my home, where my wife and daughter were, it didn't make for the most enjoyable evening, let me tell you. What happened next was even more long and drawn out than the first half of the story, so I'll try to just condense things as best I can so I can skip to the juicy stuff, and not all this relatively boring legal stuff. So, the guy gets arrested, needless to say, and the cops throw the book at him. He was looking at armed robbery, criminal trespassing, possession of a weapon during a crime, and I think a bunch of other stuff like reckless endangerment, but I'm hardly some legal eagle, so don't go quoting me on that. He ended up getting a suspended sentence on account of a bunch of different factors, but he was banned from owning firearms in Illinois, was forced to attend addiction counseling for his drinking, and if he breached any of his conditions for the next few years, then he was off to prison for at least a year and a half. Now, my wife and I were somewhat happy with the results. It hurt him where it hurt in a sense, because I think he was a big gun guy, but it put a real damper on our move, knowing that we lived down the street from such a psychopath. And now for the best part, or at least the part that I usually round the story off so it's not so insanely dark and disturbing. Obviously, anyone who gets drunk and performs a small-scale home invasion is obviously not of sound mind, but the truth is, there was a method to this guy's madness. He wasn't hell-bent on getting his doll back because of some Mr. Burns-esque affection for his childhood doll. It had almost no sentimental value to him whatsoever. The reason he was so intent on retrieving it was because it was worth way more than just $5. Before their yard sale, the couple had dug out a bunch of stuff from around their home and had gone about separating the stuff that they could sell online for higher prices from the stuff they could try and hawk at a yard sale before carting off to the city dump. During the process of emptying out their attic, the couple had found the doll, presumably the possession of some long-departed relative, and the husband had set about trying to get it evaluated. And that's when he finds out that the doll was handmade in pre-World War II Germany, specifically in the city of Nuremberg. I'm guessing the husband or wife's relative served in Germany after the war and had probably been a part of the Nuremberg trials in some capacity. Then, because Nuremberg is famous for its doll manufacturers, these relatives pick up a doll for what would have then been just a few bucks. Remember, Germany was broke by the end of the war, and then brought it back stateside to give to their kids. Well, as it turns out, this doll was almost a one-of-a-kind. one of 3 to be exact, that had been manufactured by a company called Kammer and Reinhardt. Their factory had been damaged during the war, and it took them years before they were able to return to pre-war manufacturing levels, which made the series of dolls that we were in possession of a highly valued collector's item. I don't want to say exactly how much the doll is worth, but to give you an idea, just know that one Kammer and Reinhardt doll got almost $400,000 at auction back in 2014. $500,000 for an old kid's doll, and I'd never have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself. But after looking into it, everything suddenly made a whole lot of sense. This all came out after the cops questioned the yard sale lady in connection with the home invasion, and in order to distance herself as much as possible from what her husband had done, she told the cops absolutely everything she knew. That whole story was then repeated at the guy's hearing, and since he pleaded guilty to every charge before begging the judge for the lightest possible punishment, that's how he ended up getting nothing but the suspended sentence in that statewide firearms ban. Like I said, me and my wife weren't too pleased with the result, as we thought he deserved at least a little jail time for scaring the holy hell out of us. But we got to keep the doll. And if the threat of jail time meant yard sale husband stay the hell away from my wife and daughter, then so be it. That was almost 15 years ago now, and we've since moved down to the area of Kickapoo, so I don't know how the yard sale couple are doing, nor do I care. My daughter still has the doll, which by some kind of miracle survived her childhood ownership. We didn't tell her what it was worth until she was much older, when we knew that it was a kind of investment, and that she shouldn't go selling it on a whim for money to piss away on this and that and the other. We always cared for it, and my daughter said that she always figured it was because it reminded her of her childhood. But the truth is, we knew there had come a day when that doll might equal the down payment on a house. A lot of people have said that we were crazy to let her keep playing with the doll, after we found out how much it was worth, and at the risk of sounding overly sentimental, I'll tell you what I told them. Seeing my daughter happy, truly happy, was worth more to me than any amount of money. She got years and years worth of joy out of that thing, and even though it cost us one of the most terrifying nights of our lives, acquiring it did something very special and very unique for our family. And let me tell you, it sure as hell beats her drawing on the goddamn walls. This might sound a bit bonkers to some people, but the creepiest thing I ever saw in my life was the result of stopping at a bloody garage sale. That was the summer of 1998 in small-town Western Australia, and I was just dossing around my parents' place when I got a call from a mate of mine. He told me some old kook was throwing a garage sale, which is basically the same thing as a yard sale for all American listeners, and he was selling loads of old military stuff for dirt cheap. My mate said the fuzz had already been by to confiscate some of the stuff he'd been trying to flog because it broke some NSW statute regarding the sale of military antiques. They'd warned the bloke that he had to get permission to sell his wares, but then he'd just open up his garage again once they'd effed off, and that's when my mate and his brother spotted him while driving past their car. We were both 17 at the time, my mate and I and it was his older brother's car, but he asked if I wanted to lift over there because they were going back over after nipping back to theirs to grab some cash. My mate and I were super into war and history stuff, and my buddy said that the guy had some stuff from Vietnam. Yes, Aussies went to Nam as well. So you bet your butt that I was keen to get down there to have a gander at what this guy had on sale. Anyway, about 45 minutes later, me and my mate and his older brother are turning into the street in the Brisbane suburbs. The house was right at the end, slightly separated from the others, but then lo and behold, the garage doors open and there's all this old military kit arranged in like a controlled chaos situation all over. The guy's got helmets and hats, bits of old uniforms, and tons of random ribbons and medals. He had a load of maps from Vietnam and East Timor that had been drawn all over to show plans of attack and stuff, which we considered to be gold standard military artifacts. There were flags, rations, medical kits, propaganda leaflets, and the guy basically had bloody a military museum stashed away in his house. and my mate and I and his brother were having just an absolute ripper looking at it all and asking him questions. The guy said that he was an ex-digger, meaning a former soldier, but had been out for a while and had become something of a collector in his spare time. When we asked why he was selling all his stuff, he said he had money troubles and had needed to downsize his collection for quite some time anyways, so then was as good as time as any to put on a bit of a garage sale to raise some funds. He seemed like an alright guy, a smidge off his rocker mind, but who isn't? He was wiry, bald, with jeans and a cut-off leather jacket, like the kind bikers wear but with all the military stuff on it. After a bit of a chat and a few cigs, the guy went back inside and left us to it, and told us to give him a shout when we wanted to check out, so to speak. I think we rummaged through all that stuff for the better part of half an hour, each setting aside all the stuff we wanted to buy. There were rough pricing guides near all the little piles of ribbons and stuff, 3 for $1, buy one get one free, that kind of thing. So we were pricing all of our stuff to the dollar and making sure that we got the most for our money. But then, right as we're about ready to cash out, I spot this box of old photo albums. Nice ones too, with leather covers and all that, and they're full of old photos from all kinds of different wars and conflict zones. The only problem was, after we called the bloke out, he told me that they were a little bit pricier than the rest of the stuff. That made sense, to be honest. They were nice albums, and the photos inside could have been a bloody museum. The thing was, I'd already picked out enough stuff to clear me out. The guy said he'd put them aside for me if I wanted, only for 24 hours, but it'd give me enough time to get my hands on some more cash. So I thanked him, bought what I'd already picked out, and then went back the next day on my own to get the photo albums. It was about a 30-minute walk from my parents' place to the guy's house, so I grabbed my pack, made my way round there, and gave the bloke a knock to let him know that I was there. He comes to the door, says hello, then goes round to the garage to meet me there instead. I only had $20 on me, and each album was $4, so I had to decide which ones I wanted out of the 20 to 30 that were there. As I was going through them, me and the guy are making a bit of small talk about why I'm so interested in history and all of that, and I told him how I was thinking about signing up once I'd done a bit of traveling around Asia. He then joked about the army sending me around Asia for free if I signed up, but he knew what I was getting at. After that, there was a bit of a lull in the conversation, and I thought that he might leave me alone for a bit until I made my choices, but he lowered his voice a bit and asked me if I wanted to see something really cool. I told him it depended on what it was, but was reassured when he told me that he wanted to show me his proper collection, as he put it. The stuff that he put out for sale was stuff that he didn't mind seeing the back of, but the stuff that he kept upstairs in his office was all the stuff that he considered priceless, things he couldn't part with, and things that he'd never be able to sell, not legally anyway. My first thought was that he had a load of guns up there, rifles and such, which at the time were extremely illegal to own. This was the summer of '98, a year after the great Aussie gun amnesty of '97 and 2 years after the Port Arthur massacre in '96, where some schizo guy shot a load of people down in Tasmania. Martin Bryant, I think his name was, and he killed more than 30 people, kids included, before being captured by police. And it caused a massive amount of outrage, so the government changed all the gun laws and then did this massive buyback program to get all kinds of guns off Aussie streets. And it actually worked in a lot of ways, and I think it got nearly 500,000 guns melted down into scrap. But then a lot of gun owners didn't want to give up their rifles, and I thought that this ex-military guy might have been one of them. I was a bit nervous, if I'm being honest, so I just asked him something like, "They're not machine guns, are they?" And he laughed and said no, but that they were probably just as illegal, and not for the viewing pleasure of anyone who might daub him into the fuzz, meaning like snitch on him to the police. I should have just said no, but he seemed like a nice enough guy, and when he told me something like, "Oh, come on, I won't bite," I really did just think, what's the harm in looking? So we walked into his house, then went upstairs to what he called his office, but was really just a room with a computer and a few cabinets in it. We went inside and then opened up a drawer and got out one of those little wallet things that photos used to come in. He handed them over to me and says, "Take a look at these." And so I do. And what I saw made my jaw drop. They were photographs of dead bodies, loads of them, all hacked up and shot to pieces. The guy said that they'd been taken as evidence after a massacre in East Timor, and he'd bought them off of an Aussie peacekeeper who had brought them home with him for some godforsaken reason. He told me they obviously weren't for sale, but that he had heaps more like that stashed away if I wanted to see them. I told him I was all right, actually, but before I could say anything else, the guy went for the cabinet and opened it up while telling me, "Get a load of this then." I actually didn't want to see anything else that was graphic or gory, and that's what I meant when I said I was all right. But I think he took that as me saying that I thought the photos were boring or something, which seems bonkers to say, but I can't think of any other reason why that prompted him to show me what he showed me next. So yeah, he opens up the cabinet, pulls away a cloth from something that was covering up, and then, all of a sudden, I'm greeted by the sight of a human head, floating in a jar of God knows what kind of clear fluid. The guy said that he had it shipped over from Indonesia, that the poor guy was a communist who had been killed by some army officer, who then kept the guy's head like a trophy. The officer bloke dies. The family are only too keen to get rid of it because it obviously made him look like a monster, and then the jar somehow made it down to Oz and into the hands of my friend, the collector. It was probably the single most horrifying thing I had ever laid eyes on. Not so much because it was an actual human head that someone had cut off and jarred for the sake of posterity. That was horrific all on its own. It's what the bloke said to me as I was looking at it, just totally shocked. "Shh," he said. "He's not dead, just sleeping." And then he let out this wheezing laugh like it was the funniest thing he could possibly think of. Then, as if to clarify his point in a less insensitive way, he says to me, "No, really, looks awful peaceful, doesn't he? Especially considering the circumstances." I hadn't heard much about all the anti-communist killings in Indonesia at the time, but I've come to know a lot more in the years since I saw that floating head. I won't go into all the details. I'm sure you and your subscribers, Joel, can do that on their own, but I'm warning you now, they're not pretty. But then, that's where the guy seemed to have an eerily morbid but very good point. Considering the way in which the guy died, and by that I mean rounded up in the middle of the night and killed in the most horrible of ways, he didn't look half peaceful. Eyes closed, face perfectly relaxed, like he'd passed away peacefully in his sleep. I must have really looked disturbed because the guy then said to me, "If you think that's bad, you should have seen what they'd done to the women." I don't know why he thought that might reassure me, but it didn't, and I started edging toward the door saying, "No thanks," trying to make it clear that I wanted out of there. He tells me, "Suit yourself then," and takes me back down into the garage where I paid for the photo albums I wanted and then made my way home. He then tells me that I can come back anytime I like, but I didn't go anywhere near his street even, not for years and years. And like I said, I didn't know much about all the stuff that happened in Indonesia at the time, but I did know that having a bloody human head in a jar was way beyond illegal or criminal in any way. It was disgustingly evil. Then, by the time it had occurred to me that he could have quite easily been lying about it being a victim of some foreign conflict, I was just itching to call the police. That always gave me a chuckle these days too, because despite my military aspirations, I had a bit of an authority problem at the time. I'd never called the police on just about anyone, or so I thought, and then all it took was seeing that peaceful expression on the face of a severed head, and I was itching to hit those 3 zeros. Which, by the way, 000 is the Aussie emergency number, just in case you find yourself over here for any reason in particular. I called it in, told my parents about it, and I remember my dad's jaw being on the floor as I was telling him. He told me I did the right thing, which I really needed at the time, if I'm being honest. It might sound a bit goofy of me, but I really was that bothered about being considered a grass, even if I had just seen something that'd rightly give anyone a sleepless night. I never heard anything about it after that, and if he got raided or something, it certainly didn't make its way back to me. The only thing I really wanted out of it, after years of thinking it over, was getting that head back to the person it belonged to. I mean that figuratively, of course. You'd be returning the remains to a family or something. But if that was my brother or my dad, I think I'd really appreciate someone doing that for me. Stuff like that helps people heal, and I'm sure given all the messed up stuff that happened in Indonesia back around the Vietnam War era, that's still a heap load of healing to do. We're going back quite a while for this one, but back when I first moved out of my parents' place and into an apartment of my own, and I was faced with a major male living space trademark issue. I had next to no furniture whatsoever, and I was burning money on takeout because I had nothing to cook or eat with, but I also didn't have a car or anything at that time, so it's not like I could just drive over to a furniture warehouse and grab everything I needed. I had to find someone with a truck who was willing to take me, and what's more, I needed to save a bunch more money after blowing it all on 2 months' rent and a security deposit up front. I told myself that I could make it till my next paycheck, and I had about 100 in tips saved up by about week 2, when on my way home from work one day, I spotted a sign outside a house saying, "Yard Sale." It was a big sign, too. Propped up on the front lawn, and underneath "Yard Sale Tomorrow All Day," it said, "Furniture, clothing, prices negotiable, discounts for bulk purchase." It was a biblical moment, like a bright light shone down from heaven onto that crummy handmade sign, while a choir of angels sang hallelujah. The house where the yard sale was going to be was 2 blocks away from my apartment at the very most, so best case scenario, I could bring back a huge haul of stuff for $10 to $20, and that'd see me through until I got paid in full. And anyway, so I head down to the place the next day, and it's legitimately a treasure trove of furniture, kitchenware, all that stuff. And the people running the sale were practically giving the stuff away. They had a coffee table, a side table, all kinds of knives and forks and other kitchen utensils. They basically had everything I needed except a few odds and ends that I could pick up elsewhere. They even had a wheelbarrow that I could use to push all my purchases home in, and a random blanket that they threw in for free that I lined the wheelbarrow with to make sure my tables didn't get scratched. Once my haul was all assembled and we got to talking prices, I ended up walking away with a ton of stuff for the low, low price of $20 whole. And I do mean a ton of stuff too, including a bunch of old knickknacks and antique-looking things to give my new apartment some character. I picked up things like an ornate ashtray, even though I didn't smoke because I figured it looked cool and I could maybe put my keys in it or something. Then there was this old oil lamp that looked really cool, 2 little wooden elephant statues that looked like they came from India, a ton of other cool stuff, and then about 5 or 6 really old-looking books. I say books, 2 of them were more like tomes, and although I wasn't planning on reading any of the more archaic old titles, they'd make great decorations and add some old-world coziness to what had previously been a deeply unsettling liminal space. So, when I got all the stuff back to my apartment, I had to carry it all upstairs, which was easier said than done in the case of some pieces. My main focus was getting the coffee and side tables in place, and then I went about stocking up my kitchen with all the utensils and pretty much dumped everything else out onto the coffee table to decide where it was all going to go. I did some provisional decorating just to get an idea of where things would look their best, and then after that, I had a smoke, cracked open some brews, and then settled down to enjoy the rest of my day off. A few hours later, after I cooked myself some food for the very first time in that apartment, I splashed out on the couch and started curiously skimming through some of the old books that I'd picked up. They were relatively impressive to look at, with gold lettering printed on the spines. Not real gold, I imagine, but it looked great either way. One book was this collection of articles from some old-timey magazine called Blackwoods, which was pretty cool if you're into that kind of thing, so I remember flicking through that for a while before I made my way onto the other 2. The second book was this cool old French to English dictionary with all this amazingly intricate printing on the inside covers, but it was all in French, As in, it was written for French people, so it was pretty much useless to me unless I knew the French word that I wanted to look up. That's when I picked up the third book, which was a biography of some old Italian monk, and after skimming through the pages, I went to place it back on the coffee table, and this little envelope slips out from between two of the pages. There was nothing written on the envelope's cover, but I figured that it must be some kind of old letter inside, and so out of sheer curiosity, I flipped the thing over and opened it up. Inside were maybe 5 or 6 old photographs. I couldn't tell how old, just that they were, and at first I could only see the first one. I didn't look through them in order, I just glanced at the first photo, which was of a young girl who looked like she was dressed for church, or possibly her first day of school considering the scowl that she had on her face. It was such an innocent-looking picture that it totally disarmed me, and I didn't hesitate to take the whole bunch out of the envelope before spreading them out on the table in front of me so I could take a look at all of them at once. The second I did, I got these split-second glances at all 5 pictures, and I remember literally standing up and walking away from my couch after yelling out an almost involuntary, "Oh my God." From the brief glance of what I saw depicted in those photographs, I had the gut instinct to just burn the entire apartment block down. I guess that probably makes me sound crazy, but you know that feeling that you get when you see like a nope the hell out of there picture on Instagram or whatever? It'll be a picture of like 1,000 spiders just skittering around a crawl space, or the glowing eyes of a crocodile peeping back at you in a dark sewer, and all the comments are just like, nope, kill it with fire and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the kind of picture that makes your skin crawl, has you shuddering, and makes you physically recoil away from it after giving you a tangible physical sensation of disgust and dread and horror. Well, take that feeling and multiply it by 10, and I think you've got something like what I was feeling after seeing what was depicted in those photographs. I'm sure you'll understand when I say that I want to spend as little time describing these things as possible. So if what I'm about to type seems a little nondescript or vague or whatever, then sorry, but it's the best you're going to get. So like I said, the first picture was innocent looking and lulled me into a sort of false sense of security. But then the others, the girl didn't just look grumpy anymore. She looked scared. There were men on horseback, wearing creepy, pointy hoods that looked like Klan hoods but were black and way taller. In other pictures, they were off the horses, holding the girl while she cried. There was another picture, one last one, but that one I'm not going to describe. Just know it was one that made me certain that what I had in my possession wasn't just disturbing or immoral. It was downright illegal, and most definitely evil. I stayed away from my couch and coffee table like they were radioactive as I called 911 and asked what I should do. The dispatcher lady took a minute to connect me to the cops, and then they told me to just put the photos back in the envelope and put them aside for them to come collect as soon as they could. I told them that I didn't want my fingerprints on them and that I didn't want to have to look at them again, but the cop told me that my forensics were probably all over them by now, that the best way not to see them again was to put them away, and that the fact that I reported the photos meant that I won't be charged with possession of them. Everything the lady said made sense, but I was still freaking out, and wanted the cops to come by my apartment right away so they could take the photos and get them the hell away from me. But unfortunately, that wasn't going to happen. It was classed as a non-emergency thing, meaning that I'd have to wait the whole next day, Sunday, before detectives from the relevant department would drive out to talk to me and collect those pictures. I kept trying to tell her that it wasn't so much the pictures they needed urgent action for, it was the people that I bought the books from. I didn't know the address by heart, but I could show the cops where the yard sale had been so they could go and question the people there as to where they gotten the books. The lady responded by saying that if I knew where they lived, that there was no need to rush over there. I guess that makes sense to a police department who are dealing with a busy weekend and with limited resources at that, but to me, at the time, it seemed completely crazy. What was happening to the girl in those pictures, it warranted the attention of every cop in the city. So to hear an officer herself tell me that they simply weren't a priority because they didn't constitute a violent crime, I guess I just didn't expect to hear that, is all. Now anyway, I shoved those pictures back into the envelope using a dishcloth to cover my hand, and then made the mistake of thinking that I might be able to sleep a few hours later after I tried to brain bleach those pictures out of my head with as much Adult Swim as I could consume. I realized pretty quickly that I wasn't getting any sleep that night, and after staying up smoking for a few hours, I started to fixate on walking back to the house where the yard sale had been to just, I don't know, check the place out. I didn't end up trying to break in or anything like that. Heck, I didn't even go near the place, really. I just stood across the street, smoking cigarettes and watching the front windows. All the lights were off. They stayed off and no one exited or entered. No one I could see anyway. I'll admit it, I got scared. There probably wasn't anything to be afraid of either, and I just totally got into my own head about it. There's no way they deliberately put those pictures in that book, in the hopes someone like me would one day find them. Something else was clearly going on, and breaking into that house wasn't going to get me anywhere but shot or in jail. And the next day I called the police department again, just to make sure someone was definitely coming over the next morning to pick up the pictures. They said they'd already been in touch with the relevant department and that 2 detectives would most likely stop by either Monday or Tuesday. I told them again that they should probably get some cops over to the yard sale house to question those folks there on who'd owned the books that I'd bought. The guy I spoke to that Sunday, who was a different cop than the one I'd talked to the night before, said that he'd make a point of doing just that. I mean, as in sending some officers over to the place. And I must have sounded pretty frantic by the time I was asking him to promise me that he'd send some officers over, and in all fairness, his tone changed completely when he asked me to recap what I'd told the first cop I'd spoken to. Once he understood how serious it all was, and more importantly how disturbed and freaked out I must have been, he'd swore that he'd get a patrol unit on it immediately, and I later found out that he was true to his word. The next day, when 2 detectives stopped by to pick up the photos and talk to me about the yard sale, they told me 2 uniformed officers had stopped by the yard sale house the previous evening, only to find the house empty. It had been put up for sale by the previous owners, and the 2 detectives I talked to were very interested in catching up with them to find out where they'd gotten the pictures. The 2 cops acted very much on my side and very grateful for all the information I had to give them, but before they left, they hit me with something that sounded a lot like bad news at the time. They told me I wasn't being considered a suspect as my story seemed to check out, but what I would need to do was head over to the precinct so they could get my fingerprints on file. That way they could isolate any prints on the pictures that weren't mine and potentially find out who had been the last person to handle them. I guess that's logical, and I know I shouldn't have anything to worry about, but at the time, I felt like that's what they'd said to every suspect, just to lull them into a false sense of security and get them to give up fingerprints, DNA, or whatever the cops ask. I was intensely paranoid that I was somehow going to be implicated in the whole thing, even though the photos looked to be decades old, and I myself had been the one to report them. But in the end, those fears proved to be unfounded, and I was never contacted again following that first and final talk with the 2 detectives. One of them gave me his contact number, just in case I remembered anything else about that yard sale, and for a while after, I thought about calling him to see how the whole investigation thing was going on. But, and I'm honestly a little ashamed to say this, I didn't. I was interested. I wanted to know how the hell those pictures had ended up in that book, but I also knew the best thing I could possibly do was to just try and forget about it. But then just because that was the right thing for me to do, doesn't mean I was able to do it. And I guess that's how I ended up sitting down to write all of this in the first place. Seeing the things that I did that night, they're not things you ever really forget. I think the closest I came was around the holidays of 2018, but then that whole Epstein Island thing happened, and his death was in the news a bunch, so it's been on my mind a lot ever since then. I guess I really didn't want to know what happened with that investigation because I didn't want to hear that the people responsible for the pictures were never going to be caught. You can call me a conspiracy theorist if you want, but I guess that's just something I've noticed a lot. How there's some people who do the worst things you and I could ever imagine, and somehow they seem to just get away with it. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/LetsReadOfficial, or send it over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narration and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to become a member today. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, and they're located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, hamsters are stuck in purgatory.